series from the Office of Graduate Research at Flinders University. Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon. I'm the Dean of Graduate Research at Flinders University and also the Professor of Cultural Studies at Flinders University. And I'm about to talk to somebody else who's also a Professor of Cultural Studies. And what are we going to talk about today? Well, a very significant and interesting phrase, which I believe is one to watch, and that is nano-learning, one word or two. Now, as we all know, flipped learning and open educational resources, or OERs, have been with us for over half a decade now. But what is the next step in learning development? Well, I think nano-learning is a contender. Nano-learning is a short, 2 to 15 minute learning moment. It is enabled through digitisation. So this is where we start to talk about tweets, podcasts, YouTube clips. All of these provide the platform for learning, but perhaps also models and tropes for learning. It's more than simply a media. It's also a way of thinking and a genre of thinking. So let's talk about nano-learning with Steve Redhead, Professor of Cultural Studies at Flinders University. Good morning, Steve.
Good morning.
Lovely to see you on this beautiful long weekend in Adelaide.
It's magnificent, after the storm.
Yes, after the storm, and we're probably going to get to that a little bit because it was a bit Virillian, that storm, and we're going to summon Virilio today. So, Steve, Virilio talked about speed and acceleration. I would argue probably Virilio was and is the theorist of speed and thinking about accelerated culture. So do you think that nano-learning is the andragogical arm, if you will, of Virilio's studies?
Yes, I do think Virilio has been prescient for a long time, and in some ways the world, as he calls it, the grey world, in his grey ecology, has caught up with Virilio's ideas.
Yes.
Like the South Australian blackout, which I experienced, and you didn't because you were in Western Australia this week, conference. But that was a Virillian event. The whole state of South Australia blacked out because of supposedly an extreme weather event. Certainly 80,000 lightning strikes in South Australia.
Wow.
It's pretty hard. But the thing about Virilio, who's now 83, 84, still writing, still producing, is that, as I say, in some ways the world has caught up with his concepts, and particularly, I think, the idea of speed. He's always been interesting on that, and I kind of generated my concept of accelerated culture many years ago out of Virilio's rather odd conceptualizations around speed and politics, but I think he was prescient. And I think that's interesting in terms of learning. It is interesting in terms of how you would teach Virilio and how you would use Virilio in this sort of way. And I think he was always interested in the nano. One of the things that people don't pick up on, and don't read enough of him, is that he did actually talk a lot about miniaturization, particularly in terms of technology. And that was a very interesting set of ideas to follow in little articles or short books that he wrote. So I think he is a theorist to be concentrating on here for the nano.
Yeah, what's interesting to me too is that Virilio, high theorist, and obviously you, Steve, you're also a high theorist, but you do creative industries and practical policy work as well.
Yes.
I would argue Virilio really didn't.
No. Although he did actually, I mean, all his life he's been interested in housing and the homeless from that kind of an anarchistic Christian background. He has been interested in policy work, but it's not in the areas that he theorises.
No, and the other point I was going to make is the theorisation of speed has not been tethered to the transformations of work and the transformations to leisure, to learning, to teaching and to education.
Yeah.
So what I think is significant, there's a little bit of work to be done
I think so.
From the theoretical perspective, which I think is valuable, and of course that miniaturisation work is dead crucial and can be applied to this nano-learning concept. And I would argue nano-learning is under-theorised.
Yes.
Virilio is over-theorised, and we need to find a way to connect them both up, because also I would argue nano-learning has emerged because of, am I arguing at causality? I probably am. Nano-learning has emerged because of the changes to work, to leisure, to consumption, to family life.
Yeah, to the university.
To the university, I think. And we're going to get into that now. So I think part of nano-learning is linking to rich, what I call born digital materials.
Right.
So how can nano-learning use, for example, the capacity of YouTube? You and I have used YouTube on and off, but increasingly, I would argue, in the last 5 to 6 years for learning, for teaching, for research dissemination.
Yep.
What is the role of this amazing free resource, YouTube, for this nano-learning project?
I mean, I haven't really thought a lot about it, and these questions are forcing me to think that. I mean, certainly, I tend to use things like YouTube and Twitter and Facebook for research, actually, and so they're a resource in that sense.
Yes.
So, for example, a lot of the YouTube and Twitter things that I've put out and retweeted, and put out to people, I've then gone back and used that as an archive for my writing and for my research. It's almost making sure at the time I was interested in, putting it out there and also using it for my postgraduate students.
Yes.
So it is postgraduate student teaching, but also for my own research. I build up an archive, say in Twitter, of tweets and YouTube of videos, which I can go back to. I've referenced them myself, then gone back to them, and at leisure worked over them. So I think that's quite an interesting way of using it for teaching and research.
And we'll come back to Twitter in a second, but what's interesting with how you're using it at the moment is you're using it as nano note-taking.
I am. That's exactly what I'm doing. And the same with YouTube.
And so that's significant. With YouTube, I think there are multiple ways we can use it. And let's try and develop some theory on the run here. What we could be using it for, and what I certainly have used it for, is it's a remarkable historical archive.
Yes.
So if you're teaching, for example, communication studies, if you're teaching international studies, international relations, languages, for example, you're able to deploy all these incredible heritage film moments. So there is, for example, I know you and I've seen it so many times, that fantastic interview between Chomsky and Foucault in French in Paris.
Yes.
And it's fantastic, Chomsky being so intellectually generous and Foucault is being his usual flippant, I've got a cigarette and I'm not terribly interested with anything that's going on. But it's an incredible moment that was captured on analogue film and has been position for all of us to see for free. So that's a nano-learning moment. So we've got all this incredible footage of all these remarkable speeches and events and so forth that it, as a digital archive, is now available so the students can see the original.
That's right. And I am doing that specifically for my book Theoretical Times, and I have been doing it for a while, particularly with regard to theorists at the European Graduate School.
Magnificent.
And of course, those... particularly the 4 theorists that I've been using are Alain Badiou, Slavoj Žižek, Jean Baudrillard and Paul Virilio. One of those is dead, Baudrillard, but actually you can see a lot of his European Graduate School lectures still in both English and French on YouTube, and I do use those, and again I use them as an archive, and I do with the other theorists, and in fact other theorists who cross their paths.
Yes.
So it's a remarkable nano-learning use.
That's right. So it can be looped into existing teaching, learning and research training in our present.
Yes.
But further, we can then configure videos, as you and I have been doing very recently. Of course, I'm doing weekly vlogs, and you've been helping me so much in so many different ways for also research training for our colleagues at Flinders. It is possible to create bespoke video that is part of what I used to call flipped learning. So in other words, here's an intense 10 minutes of video. Please see that before you come to the real live seminar. So that's where I think the flipped learning experience, which we've been working with very strongly this year, aligns with the nano learning because it's even more intense and indeed, to quote Virilio, miniaturized.
Yes, and I think also you can do promotional and marketing work, which is also part of that nano learning. It's both. So, for example, when I set up my YouTube channel about a year ago, it was specifically based around the book Football and Accelerated Culture, which Routledge produced at the time. But that is material, certainly, the micro interviews that you and I did around that and are still there, can be used for teaching and learning around sporting claustropolis or physical cultural studies or the concepts that were mentioned in the book.
And that's the great potential, I think, of open educational resources, the OERs, because they are transferable.
Yeah.
That they can move from one location and through learning management systems or whatever, through pretty easy code, can be embedded at speed. And you've talked about our podcasts and indeed our podcasts and vlogs. And very early on, we've been podcasting, as colleagues know, listening to this recording, for a very, very long time. We were probably some of the first academics to be podcasting. Were. Yes, but I dragged you into it like I always do. But we were there very, very early. And I think we've explored the diversity of genres as podcasting itself has changed. But very early on when we were both at Brighton, the University of Brighton, we used and invented, I think it is ours, we invented what I called the micro interview.
Yes.
Which is via podcast, I would ask one question and you would answer it. So what is, for example, a post-youth culture, Steve? What is a digital leisure culture? And you would give an answer and I would deploy that 2 minutes of sound in a lecture theatre to provide alternative voices, which of course adds diversity to the analogue lecture experience. But it could also then be deployed from first year right through to master's level. We've used this stuff as can be embedded in a learning management system. So a Blackboard, for example, you just embed the code, embed the link, and it can provide a discussion point for students. They listen to 2 minutes, micro-learning, nano-learning. They listen to 2 minutes and then it commences discussion. So how can sound-only resources, so podcasts, be used in the future as part of this nano-learning?
Well, I think that they are, because they're there. I mean, the ones you're talking about are now quite old. They're 2008, 2009. If you go back to them, and I think they have been used quite widely.
Heavily, yes.
But they were very specific. And as you say, they were one question and one answer. But as we've developed these sorts of ideas, the sound, I mean, actually sound quality has improved, the sort of technological devices we've been using. I mean, they're really broadcast quality.
We use the same for listeners. We use the same materials that the BBC use. So, that's the nature of the domestication of high-quality hardware, if you will, that we're using the same materials and software that the BBC uses. So it means conventional academics like us can, in our lounge room, as we're doing right now, produce pretty high-quality materials for you to listen to at your leisure.
Yeah, and it is a real punk thing. It's democratised that technology. I think we overuse that sometimes, but actually that has happened. So, particularly in terms of podcasts, they've developed from the micro interview through really quite complex ways of interrogating questions, which sometimes in our case we've done things up to 40, 45 minutes, an hour.
That's right.
And and we've actually done seminars which we've used for the podcast. So I think there's all sorts of ways that podcasts can be used in the future like this. We've actually created a real ground for all of this.
Because you can allow the content to configure the length of time through which the podcast would progress. So if it is, as for example, this conversation today will probably be about 15, 20 minutes in length. Some of our other ones might only be 5 or 6 minutes. But the advantage of sound only, and of course, you guys out there know that I've written a lot on this. You've obviously written a lot on popular music, Steve, but sound-only resources are often described as defamiliarising our relationship with our environment. So we're used to video because we see with our eyes. In the empire of the senses, if I can summon that phrase, the eyes lead how we think about learning. When we take the eyes away, we only have sound, so it means that students engage with material differently. So having a nano-learning experience via sound, I think, is quite transformative and important.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Very powerful. We're nearly through this, Steve, and again, thank you for this, because this is going to be big, I think.
I think it is.
With you, I always try and, for our listeners, get in early, offer our commentaries. We'll obviously be writing pieces on this the next year or so, but it is always great, I think, when the podcast leads the ideas. So one characteristic of nano-learning that's emerging is, of course, the use of the open educational resources, OERs. Now, you and I have really put just about 80 or 90% of our publications and the work that we do in the open access environment. It means a lot to us, and a big hi to Mick Winter. I know it means a lot to Mick as well. Open access is what we do. So a lot of our academic work operates outside of corporate interests, capitalist publishers, if you will. So Is there the potential, do you think, for nano-learning to remain a bit of that DIY democratisation that you've talked about already, to be a bit of a ratbag renegade outside of these corporate interests? Or do you think because it is so sellable and sexy that, like MOOCs, it'll start to be clawed back into corporate interests? What do you think will happen?
Yeah, I think there's a great danger in that. And I do think, I mean, certainly let's embrace the technology and so on, but I think you have to decide what you're doing in the first place for. And a lot of our commitment to open access was so that ideas which were outside the mainstream a lot of the time, because the mainstream had and has become so banal and and lacking in progress, really.
Lacking in reading, lacking in depth,
absolutely,
it's
contributed to anti-intellectual culture, in my view, particularly in Australia.
Yeah.
But I think you always have to watch that. You always have to watch how corporate interests, as you put it, really start to dominate what was quite an alternative or marginality.
Yes.
I think that's a great danger, difficult to ride that wave.
Yeah, but I think it's good right at the start that we recognise this, that if we develop all these open educational resources that are nano-learning ready, if you will, that we are always aware that they are used in terms of democracy, social justice, academic, progressive values.
Critique.
So they are free for anybody on this planet to use rather than housed within some corporate structures. Final question, Steve, and this has been a fascinating discussion, this one. I've really enjoyed it. You and I believe very strongly in the lecture, the real-time analogue lecture, scholars, the best scholars in the world, coming together, sharing space, sharing time, sharing ideas. You and I have backed ourselves on that. You're one of the best lecturers I've ever seen. I'm a pretty good lecturer. This matters to us. We spend hundreds of hours making this a quality experience for students. But flipped learning, online learning, casualisation, the precariat that is the nature of the academic workforce at the moment means that probably we are losing the lecture, and it is a great tragedy because it is a great intellectual event in a young scholar's life, and it'd be very sad if we lose the notion of an academic event, I think. But what is the future of the lecture in a nano-learning environment?
Yeah, I think there's a great danger there, and I agree with you with throwing the baby out with the bathwater if we actually get rid of the lecture. But there's no doubt that there are all sorts of ways in which the nano-learning can actually reflect back on the lecture, so that it's not to say that there can't be a dynamic between the two things, but I think we have to be very careful in case we do lose it. And, it's been under threat for so long.
Yeah.
But there's a reason for it being there.
Yeah, how we have used it, and I've used it in this way. In fact, I didn't know it was nano-learning. I now know that it is. I was doing it before the term was invented. How I used a lot of podcasts really since the Murdoch days, actually. So that's over a decade. And this was actually to help off-campus part-time students at the time. But I would always record a 2 or 3 minute podcast for the students to listen to before the lecture, so they would be oriented into the space of the lecture, and they would arrive at least knowing what some of the terms or the idea or the vibe was. So that, of course, was a nano-learning moment, digital, before the analogue lecture, and I would do a digital nano-learning moment after the lecture in a short podcast saying, guys, this is what we did in this lecture, and maybe think about how it connects to the tutorial. So the nano-learning moments can be the mortar in between the bricks of the analogue experiences as well, I think. Yeah,
I think that's a great way of putting it. But I think we have to be careful not to lose what is a good structure.
Well said. Steve, thank you so much for this conversation. Guys and girls, I'd love to hear from you on this one. This is big. I think I'm going to write something on this. I've been doing a lot of work on flipped learning, as most of you know, and I've been doing a lot of flipped learning and particularly flipped training, and try to make that better in some ways than a lot of the MOOC experiences have been in the last 5 years. I think we are succeeding in creating some good flipped strategies. But probably the nano-learning experience that's often being used with the phrase micro-credentialing these days will be quite significant. So this is a term to watch, and thank you for sharing us as we start to explore that term together. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
For more information about the Office of Graduate Research at Flinders University, please refer to www.flinders.edu.au. flinders.edu.au/graduate-research.